presidente eleito dos Estados Unidos, Joe Biden, conversou com o Papa Francisco na manhã de hoje, viu? E a conversa não foi pública.
Biden citou o Papa João Paulo II, invocou com frequência suas raízes católicas irlandesas e prometeu restaurar a alma dos Estados Unidos.
Third straight night, Portland police declared a riot.
The vast majority of the protest has been peaceful.
Over the weekend, 59 officers injured and 47 people arrested.
New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announcing a proposal to cut $1 billion from the New York City Police Department.
We need to completely dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department.
But in the flurry of media hype, one notice didn't get as much play. It was the congratulatory statement from the nation's bishops' conference. You know, the ones who collectively plotted to cover up the rape of thousands of altar boys and deny them justice. The ones who were just fine staying silent as Biden paraded around his basement on social media, passing himself off as a Catholic, despite his loving embrace of child slaughter and sodomy. Let's draw the connection, shall we? The media is Luciferian because they engage in the work of the devil, which in a word is deceit.
We're living in one of the most perilous times in human history. The first century BC poet Virgil stated, "Blessed is he who understands the hidden causes of things." And if you understand the causes of things, you will not only understand, but as well anticipate what will be happening around you in the coming months. Because in order to transform our culture, our economy, to transform our political structures, to transform our religions, our societies, against the realized democratic will of the people, you must go through several steps in transformation. A psychological transformation, a physical and philosophical transformation, a cultural and political transformation, and a spiritual transformation as well. And in fact, gaining an entirely new ecumenical metaphysic.
The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. It sets out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. This is, they go on to say, the analytical lens that CRT uses in examining existing power structures. And you hear the language automatically again takes us back to Marx and Marxian concepts. I've seen all relationships in terms of power structures, those who have power and those who do not. Power dynamics defines the oppressors and the oppressed peoples of our society.
I've got no patience for Marxists. There's no excuse for it. There's no more excuse for it than there is for being a Nazi, in my estimation. And now maybe you should say, well, I should have patience for Nazis, but I don't.
Of course, that's not what I'm saying.
No, but
I think
it's not so clear that it's not what you're saying. No, because it is the Marxists that I'm objecting to. And somehow it's okay to be a Marxist because maybe you're for the poor, even though you're not. I don't think it's okay to be a Marxist. I don't even think it's a little bit okay to be a Marxist. I think maybe in 1918, when you didn't know any better, even though wise people had already warned against the danger for at least 50 years, then maybe you could have assumed that you would bring in the utopia with your ideas of equity. But it's 100 years later, and we've seen the carnage.
But you really see these people as the same thing as the Marxists, the Stalinist
they
Marxists.
call themselves Marxists. No, they're worse than the Stalinist Marxists. Because the Stalinist Marxists didn't know who Stalin was going to be. And we know who Stalin was, and we know who Mao was, and we know who Pol Pot was.
So let's make this clear. You really think that these people who are battling for social justice, against discrimination, that they want some sort of Stalinist regime?
Well, they wouldn't say that. No, of course they wouldn't say that. Their policies would lead inevitably to it. And God only knows what they want in their heart of hearts. You know, it's the postmodern neo-Marxist types who are always on about power. Every structure is predicated on power.
He who defines the problem gets to define the solution. And if the main problem that people of color have is that they are inevitably oppressed by structures that are inherently oppressive, then the only solution is to tear down those structures. And this must be done by political maneuvers.
Sadly, we're watching the dismantling of an entire civilization by people who claim that in doing so, they're serving the liberation of humanity. We are watching day by day, moment by moment, the realization of the great technocratic, oligarchical, intersectional, postmodern Fabian socialist dream. The move, simply put, is to transform our society from an analog civilization to a digital civilization.
CRT identifies that these power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. CRT also rejects the traditions of liberalism and meritocracy. To say that you ought to be rewarded on the basis of merit is merely a way of furthering white privilege and white supremacy.
But if you make that claim, then you have to ask, well, why exactly is it that you're claiming that every structure is based on power? What exactly does that have to do with your own motivations if you happen to be embedded in a structure? Does that mean, what, are you somehow immune to that if it's the only game in town? Or is it exactly what you're pursuing?
Think about how many things that are happening around you right now in the world, not just right now, but over the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years, where things that you know that are, you're being told not to believe those things, to cast doubt upon them. Not only things such as biological truths, but even just straight up math.
If all of this sounds rather dissonant and counterintuitive to you, that's because it is. As a friend of mine used to always say, if it doesn't make sense, it's because it doesn't make sense. And that's really the basis of mind control. It's getting you to begin to believe the unbelievable, to accept the unacceptable, and to begin to act as if what is unbelievable and unacceptable is actually normal. And if you don't embrace those things, then you're the one who is abnormal.
Now, after so much progress over the last 50 years, human beings are accusing other human beings of collective guilt based upon their skin color.
I don't like people who play group identity politics. They're promoting tribalism. Tribal societies are extraordinarily dangerous. And I think they're doing it primarily because of resentment. I certainly don't trust the Marxism, and why would I? I mean, how is it You tell me. You tell me, after 150 million deaths, how it's okay to be a Marxist.
But that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is the type of language you're using to qualify your opponents. It seems polarizing as well.
It depends on the opponents. I don't like Marxists. It isn't that I don't like them. There's no excuse for it. You'd call me polarizing if I objected to Nazis? Yes or no? If I objected to Nazis, am I polarizing or not?
But you see these people who want the gender-neutral pronouns. That's basically their main point. You see them...
That's their claimed main point.
But you think they're actually more dangerous than this?
It isn't that I think they're more dangerous than this. I know they're more dangerous than this.
If these ideologies are left unchecked, they will result not only in growing hatred between people of different colors and ethnicities, but it will also result in the overthrow of this nation from within by forces that are at war with the very principles of righteousness on which this nation was founded.
Because this is socialism. And when I say that socialism is diametric to Christianity, what I'm telling you is that socialism says the government is God. The government will tell you what you can do and what you can do and when you can do it and how far you can do it and how long you can do it. That is basically replacing the freedom of choice with the governance of men, and the men who get into those positions rarely if ever want to give them up, because they themselves are obsessed with power and control.
Why has the entire foundation of law and justice been cast aside in an all-out embrace of neo-Marxist source social justice conformity? You need to ask yourself this. Why have the Judeo-Christian concepts of freedom and liberty been thrown into the ash heap of history as the nations of the earth sprint towards the chains of global manipulation?
And when a nation of people pushes morality out the door and pushes God out the door, then we've released the wild stallion. The bridle has been taken off. And the forces of evil are ready to rampage across the scene. And that's what we've seen. Readily, these bridles and barriers and pillars have been overtaken for the last 60 years. Rather than following the biblical injunction of train a child in the way he should go, we've allowed our children to pretty much grow up unsupervised. We leaned upon Mr. Rogers and the Muppets and these other shows, not realizing that even within their very programs, they were feeding the seeds of Marxist socialism. So that today, I was watching cartoons with my kids, my grandkids, and I was shocked by the politics that were being promoted, even in these children's programs.
And the same is true of intersectionality, which is a way of identifying people that grew out of CRT studies and in many ways is more insidious and corrosive in its impact on social relationships and society at large. Like CRT, intersectionality views the world through the lens of power dynamics, with a person's social position best understood in terms of power and privilege or in terms of discrimination and disadvantage. So, for example, by current measurements, a black man is more oppressed than a white man, but a black woman is more oppressed than a black man. But a black lesbian woman is more oppressed than a black heterosexual woman. A black transgendered lesbian woman is more oppressed than a black lesbian woman. And on and on and on it goes.
Okay, how many identities do you have, do you think? Let's say 10. Okay, you're an oppressor on at least 2 of them. You're white.
Yeah, and middle class.
Okay, good, 2. So, when the revolution comes, you can have your 8 dimensions of victimization and your 2 dimensions of oppression. And you can bloody well be sure that you'll be punished for the oppression and not rewarded for the victimization. And that is what happened in the Russian Revolution. And it's an inevitable consequence of those sorts of policies. because you can fragment people's identities to the point where you find where they're the oppressor. And as soon as they're the oppressor, even for one reason, then they're the enemy. And if you happen to be the sort of person who enjoys collecting enemies, let's say, and there's plenty of people like that, then one reason that you're the enemy is more than sufficient.
But nevertheless, win or lose, dark days are ahead of us. We cannot assume that the enemies of our freedom and our religion are going to go away, and they are our enemies. When Antifa burnt Bibles and the flag in the streets of Portland, they were sending a message.
So those who promote the use of critical race theory and intersectionality are standing against what the Word of God teaches about the nature of humanity, the nature of sin, the nature of righteousness, and the nature of grace. These ideologies are incompatible with the authority and sufficiency of God's Word, and therefore they're incompatible with the faith, the Christianity which the Bible reveals. They have ideas and principles embedded within them that are not only antithetical to the way of Christ, but are also committed to the deconstruction of the Christian faith, because they believe that very faith to be part of the oppressive power system that systemically and unjustly oppresses marginalized people.
When the bishop's statement was published Saturday on the heels of the media projections, sincere and honest Catholics, neither of which this crowd of emasculated and homosexual men would know anything about, collectively convulsed and grew instantly angry. Angry at the lies, the cheating, the deception, the injustice, the continued cooperation with evil that these men portray. Never once have they lifted a finger in the cause of justice for the unborn. And since a giant number of them are gay themselves, having gotten through seminary, no doubt, by passing certain examinations by their own bishops and faculty, they, of course, would scurry to the bandwagon of Biden. Perhaps most insulting to Catholics, not to mention God himself, because of the extent of the lie, was this line from their statement. Quote, "We congratulate Mr. Biden and acknowledge that he joins the late President John F. Kennedy as the second United States president to profess the Catholic faith." Closed quote. In precisely what universe do these devils think Biden professes the Catholic faith? If Biden professes the Catholic faith, then the same could be said of Hitler, who was likewise a baptized Catholic, and like Biden, at baptism is just about where any pretense to Catholicism stopped. Whatever number of human lives Hitler had on his hands when he died, it would have paled compared to what Uncle Joe will have on his hands when he at last dies. The bishops, more than any politicians, have not just the blood of countless millions of innocent children on their hands, but most frighteningly, the damnation of tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of souls. The offspring of the devil, like all offspring, resemble each other, sometimes remarkably. This is one of those times where a remarkable resemblance is clearly visible. They have more in common than they disagree on, and when it comes to self-interest, they each lay aside their differences, pretended or not.